This security footage just changed everything.
You can't continue to keep hurting people and nothing ever happens. Just a matter of time.
And it might be the reason Diddy never walks free again. Cassie's CCTV didn't just surface randomly. It didn't leak as noise. It connected directly to Netflix's The Reckoning in a way that instantly changed how this entire case is being looked at. And that connection is exactly why the most serious consequence possible is back in discussion. This isn't about shock value. This isn't about public outrage. This is about Cassie's footage lining up with what was already on record so cleanly that debate stopped and reassessment began. And once you see how that connection works, it becomes clear why Diddy's situation just entered a far more dangerous phase. Before we go any further, I want your honest take. Do you believe Cassie's CCTV is the missing piece that forces everything into focus? Or was Diddy already heading toward this outcome behind the scenes? Let me know in the comments. And if you want evidence-based breakdowns that go deeper than headlines, subscribe to the Hidden Evidence now. For a long time, the biggest protection in Diddy's case was separation. Cassie's statements existed in testimony. Visual material existed in fragments. Timelines lived inside paperwork. Nothing fully overlapped. That separation allowed uncertainty to survive, and uncertainty is where defenses breathe. Cassie's CCTV changed that. Security footage doesn't persuade, it doesn't accuse. It simply exists inside time and space. And when Cassie's CCTV was reviewed alongside The Reckoning, something critical happened. Descriptions became placement, claims became structure, and memory became environment. That shift is subtle, but it's decisive. What makes Cassie's CCTV so powerful isn't just what it shows, but when it shows it. Moments Cassie previously described are no longer abstract. Movement, proximity, and duration are now fixed. And once details are fixed, interpretation tightens. That tightening is what triggered renewed attention around Diddy. Netflix's The Reckoning never claimed to introduce new evidence. What it did was reorganize existing information into sequence. And when that sequence was matched against Cassie's CCTV, the overlap became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. This is where many people misunderstand why CCTV matters so much. Courts don't use footage to prove emotion or intent. They use it to remove flexibility. When footage exists, alternate explanations lose space, gaps close, and when gaps close, patterns appear. Patterns are where sentencing changes. Earlier stages of the Diddy case focused on isolated events, individual moments evaluated separately. Cassie's CCTV does the opposite. It shows continuity, and continuity aligns disturbingly well with how The Reckoning framed Cassie's experience. Not as a single incident, but as something sustained. Once sustained behavior enters the picture, the entire severity calculation changes. Legal analysts quickly noted that Cassie's CCTV doesn't contradict earlier records, it reinforces them. And reinforcement is far more dangerous than contradiction. Contradictions invite argument. Reinforcement creates structure. Structure demands consequence. Another critical factor is neutrality. Cassie's CCTV has no motive, no memory drift, no interpretation. Judges understand that. When neutral documentation aligns with Cassie's account, credibility stops being debated and starts being assumed. That's when life sentence thresholds re-enter the conversation, not because anyone wants escalation, but because the framework expanded. Severity is measured by scope, duration, and control. Cassie's CCTV speaks to all three. Scope, by showing environment. Duration, by showing continuity. Control, by showing access and positioning. This is why the footage didn't just add weight, it redistributed it. Details once treated as background now feel central. Elements once dismissed as contextual now look structural. And once the center shifts, conclusions built on the old center become unstable. That instability is what reopened serious discussion around Diddy. Timing matters too. Cassie's CCTV didn't surface in isolation. It surfaced after The Reckoning had already reshaped understanding of Cassie's relationship with Diddy. The documentary created a lens. The CCTV slid directly into it. Without the documentary, the footage might have felt unclear. Without the footage, the documentary might have stayed narrative. Together, they became corroboration, and corroboration is what courts respond to. Sources close to the process describe this moment not as a revelation, but as a convergence. No one was shocked by what the footage showed. What shocked them was how perfectly it matched what Cassie had already described. That alignment narrowed tolerance. When tolerance narrows, maximum outcomes resurface. The idea of a life sentence didn't return because of emotion. It returned because the case now appears structurally complete in a way it wasn't before. Completion removes uncertainty, and uncertainty is what keeps sentencing lower. Silence around the footage has been noticeable. There's been no strong attempt to reframe Cassie's CCTV, no aggressive effort to contextualize it away. And when documentation exists, silence becomes strategic. Strategy reveals risk. Risk is what sentencing addresses. At this stage, the Diddy case is no longer about whether something happened. It's about how fully the system now understands what happened to Cassie. And that understanding has deepened. Deepened understanding forces recalibration. That recalibration doesn't happen loudly. It happens through review, alignment, and quiet acknowledgement that earlier interpretations may no longer hold. Once that acknowledgement exists, escalation becomes procedural. This is the most dangerous phase for any high-profile defendant. Not when headlines are loud, but when evidence settles. Because once evidence settles, it doesn't move again. And Cassie's CCTV appears to have done exactly that. It didn't accuse, it didn't exaggerate, it simply connected. And sometimes connection is enough to change everything. Once Cassie's CCTV became part of the active review, the case against Diddy moved into a different category entirely. It stopped being treated as a collection of claims and started being treated as a system of verified conditions. That shift is critical because systems are judged differently than moments. Moments can be debated. Systems have to be addressed. Cassie's CCTV didn't introduce chaos into the case, it introduced order. It gave investigators something stable to build around. When you can place Cassie in specific locations connected to Diddy at specific times for specific durations, the conversation changes from interpretation to structure. Structure limits narrative flexibility, and narrative flexibility is what had protected Diddy for so long. One of the first things reviewers looked at was proximity. Proximity alone doesn't imply wrongdoing, but it establishes opportunity. And opportunity, when repeated and sustained, becomes a key variable in legal reassessment. Cassie's CCTV showed proximity not as an exception, but as a recurring condition. That matters more than any single incident ever could. What made this especially damaging for Diddy is that Cassie's descriptions of her environment now had physical confirmation. When Cassie spoke about access, control, and presence, those words were once filtered through interpretation. Now those same ideas are reinforced by footage that places Cassie within spaces shaped by Diddy's influence. Influence is not loud, influence is consistent. CCTV captures consistency better than testimony ever can. It shows routine. And routine is one of the strongest indicators courts look at when assessing whether behavior was situational or systemic. Cassie's routine, as seen through CCTV, aligns closely with the reality she described for years. That alignment is where reassessment gains momentum. Another factor that elevated the impact of Cassie's CCTV was duration. Duration does not require any explicit act to be visible. It only requires sustained presence. When Cassie appears in the same environments tied to Diddy across extended periods, duration becomes a fact, not a claim. Duration reframes severity. Earlier evaluations of the Diddy case leaned heavily on episodic framing. Individual events were examined separately, often stripped of surrounding context. Cassie's CCTV disrupted that approach by showing continuity, not one moment, but many moments connected by space and time. Continuity implies environment. Environment implies normalization. Normalization implies tolerance. Tolerance is what raises consequence. This is why the life sentence conversation returned in a serious way. Not because of outrage, and not because of public pressure, but because the variables used to measure severity change. When courts reassess severity, they look at scope, duration, and degree of control. Cassie's CCTV intersects with all three. Scope, by revealing the environment Cassie moved within. Duration, by showing how often and how long that environment remained consistent. Control, by revealing access patterns connected to Diddy. Control is rarely proven through words alone. It's shown through movement, restriction, and repetition. CCTV captures those elements without interpretation. And when neutral documentation supports Cassie's account, the balance of credibility shifts permanently. This is why reinforcement is so dangerous for a defense. If Cassie's statements had been contradicted by footage, debate would have expanded. Instead, the opposite happened. Cassie's CCTV reinforced her narrative. Reinforcement doesn't spark argument, it closes it. Closed arguments force recalibration. Another subtle but important change occurred in how reviewers began reading earlier material. Depositions, filings, and prior statements were no longer read independently. They were read against the footage. That cross-referencing process exposed areas where earlier interpretations may have been narrower than necessary. Narrow interpretations are not errors, but once they're recognized, they must be corrected. Correction is what reopening enables. Cassie's name began appearing more frequently in professional analysis because her experience became the anchor point for understanding Diddy's conduct. This isn't about centering emotion, it's about centering structure. Cassie's proximity, Cassie's movement, Cassie's consistency form the backbone of the reassessment. Backbones determine posture, and posture determines outcome. Another area quietly influenced by the CCTV was risk assessment. Sentencing frameworks don't only look backward, they look forward. They evaluate potential for recurrence and continued influence. When Cassie's CCTV demonstrated sustained access and normalized proximity, risk assessment shifted. Risk moved from hypothetical to contextual. Contextual risk raises ceilings. That doesn't mean a life sentence is guaranteed. It means it is now justifiable within the framework. Courts operate on justifiability, not certainty. Once something becomes justifiable, it remains an active option. Options rarely disappear once they return. Defense posture changes dramatically at this stage. Earlier strategies based on distance and ambiguity lose effectiveness. Silence becomes risky. Explanation becomes constrained. Every attempt to contextualize behavior must now contend with documented consistency. Consistency is the hardest thing to argue against. This is also where the reckoning continues to matter. The documentary shaped how questions are being asked. Instead of asking whether Cassie's account is believable, reviewers are asking how Cassie's experience fits within the documented structure of Diddy's environment. Fit determines pattern. Pattern determines consequence. Legal systems are designed to respond to fit. Another consequence of the CCTV's integration is the visibility of omission. Footage defines boundaries. Once boundaries are defined, what lies outside them becomes noticeable. Reviewers begin asking what wasn't captured, why certain moments were undocumented, and whether those gaps align with existing testimony. Omissions don't accuse, but they invite scrutiny. Scrutiny expands scope. Scope expansion doesn't require new evidence. It requires new framing. Cassie's CCTV and the reckoning together created that framing. The case moved from fragmented to integrated. Integration collapses separation. Separation allowed plausible deniability. Integration removes it. This is why the Diddy case now feels heavier rather than louder. There is no surge of chaos. There is a tightening. Each review narrows interpretation further. Each layer of alignment reduces alternative explanations. Comfort zones disappear quietly. Another important factor is corroboration across independent observers. Analysts with no connection to each other reach similar conclusions when reviewing how Cassie's CCTV aligns with existing records. That convergence matters because it reduces interpretive variance. Reduced variance accelerates procedure. Once procedure accelerates, outcomes begin to take shape. Public attention often misreads this phase as stagnation. In reality, this is when cases solidify. Loud moments attract attention, but quiet moments define resolution. Cassie's CCTV moved the case into a quiet, procedural phase where outcomes are shaped deliberately rather than emotionally. Deliberation favors structure over noise. Structure now favors Cassie's account. As this phase continues, the case is no longer reacting to individual pieces of evidence. It is responding to coherence between Cassie's testimony, Cassie's documentation, and the environment connected to Diddy. Coherence does not argue, it accumulates. Accumulation defines inevitability not of a specific sentence, but of accountability. That's where the case now stands. Not at the edge of revelation, but deep inside realization. And once realization sets in, everything that follows must align with it. As the reassessment continues, the focus shifts even more sharply toward the relationship between Cassie and Diddy, not as a headline, but as a structure. At this stage, the case is no longer evaluated through isolated moments or selective framing. It's evaluated through continuity. And continuity is where Cassie's presence becomes unavoidable. Cassie is no longer referenced as a single voice among many. Cassie is now the reference point. Her movements, her access, her consistency are being used to measure how Diddy's influence functioned over time. That's a fundamental change. Once a case begins using one individual's experience as its measuring tool, everything else is evaluated relative to it. That's what's happening here. For years, discussions around Diddy were shaped by reputation and distance. Cassie's experience, by contrast, was often compartmentalized, treated as contextual, emotional, or historical. Cassie's CCTV ended that compartmentalization. It placed Cassie inside a documented environment connected directly to Diddy, repeatedly, predictably, and without interruption. Predictability is critical. Predictable proximity suggests normalization. Normalization suggests tolerance, and tolerance suggests responsibility that extends beyond isolated decisions. Courts take that progression seriously because it speaks to how environments are sustained, not just how incidents occur. This is where Cassie's name began appearing more frequently in professional analysis, not because of publicity, but because her experience now anchors interpretation. Cassie's testimony aligns with Cassie's documentation, and that alignment has proven resistant to erosion. Erosion is what defenses rely on. Defense strategies often focus on weakening memory, questioning motive, or reframing context. Cassie's record resists all three. Her language has remained consistent across time. Her descriptions align with physical placement. Her account fits within the documented structure shown through CCTV. Consistency under pressure is rare. And when consistency is supported by neutral documentation, credibility solidifies in a way that's difficult to undo. That solidity changes the posture of the entire case against Diddy. Another major shift at this stage is how power dynamics are being interpreted. Power isn't just about actions, it's about environment. Who controls space? Who determines access? Who adapts to whom? Cassie's CCTV captures these dynamics without commentary. It shows routine, positioning, and movement, all indicators of influence. Influence doesn't need to be aggressive to be significant. It needs to be sustained. Sustained influence is what raises severity. This is why the life sentence discussion resurfaced alongside Cassie's name so prominently. Not because one piece of footage demanded it, but because the accumulated picture suggested a system rather than a series of coincidences. Systems are judged differently than moments. Another element quietly reinforcing this shift is absence of contradiction. In several key areas now under review, there has been no substantial counter-narrative to Cassie's account. Silence does not equal admission, but in legal analysis, silence reduces alternatives. Reduced alternatives increase likelihood. Likelihood shapes sentencing. This phase has also changed how earlier restraint is viewed. Decisions that once appeared cautious now appear incomplete, not wrong, but limited by the framework available at the time. When frameworks expand, decisions must adapt. That adaptation is not optional, it's procedural. Cassie's experience forced that expansion. What's also notable is how the emotional tone of the case has cooled even as the stakes have risen. There is less outrage, less speculation, less noise. Instead, there is focus. Focus on alignment. Focus on structure. Focus on consequence. That's not coincidence. When cases reach this stage, emotion gives way to evaluation. Evaluation gives way to resolution. Resolution doesn't require drama, it requires coherence. Cassie's CCTV provides coherence. Cassie's testimony provides continuity. The reckoning provides narrative integration. Together, they form a framework that is increasingly difficult to dismantle without addressing it directly. Direct engagement carries risk. Risk is what sentencing frameworks are designed to manage. As reviewers continue examining how Cassie's environment evolved over time, attention is drawn to routine. CCTV captures routine more effectively than any other form of evidence. Routine shows what was expected, not what was exceptional. And when Cassie's routine is examined alongside Diddy's access and control, it raises questions that extend beyond individual actions. Those questions point toward sustained conditions. Sustained conditions redefine accountability. This is why the case now feels as though it has crossed an interpretive threshold. Not legally irreversible, but structurally stabilized. Once interpretation stabilizes around a coherent structure, reversing it becomes unlikely. That doesn't mean outcomes are predetermined. It means the range of acceptable outcomes has narrowed. And that narrowing is directly connected to Cassie's role being fully integrated into the case against Diddy. At this point, the story is no longer about discovery. It's about absorption. How fully the system absorbs Cassie's experience into its understanding of Diddy's conduct. Absorption changes everything that follows. Because once understanding evolves, it cannot ethically be ignored. And that evolution is now well underway. As the case reaches its final stage, the system is no longer gathering information, it's measuring consequence. Everything that could be integrated has been integrated. Cassie's CCTV is no longer being reviewed as a piece of media. Cassie's testimony is no longer being weighed as an isolated account. And Netflix's The Reckoning is no longer treated as narrative framing. Together, they now form a complete structure through which Diddy's conduct is being evaluated. This is the phase where outcomes stop feeling speculative. Not because a decision has been announced, but because the logic supporting that decision has stabilized. Once logic stabilizes, direction becomes clear. And the direction here is toward alignment between what was known before, what is understood now, and what responsibility looks like under that understanding. That alignment is what makes this moment decisive. For Diddy, the shift has been unmistakable. Earlier stages of the case allowed room for distance. Distance between moments. Distance between narratives. Distance between accountability and consequence. Cassie's CCTV collapsed that distance. Cassie's experience is now fully embedded in the framework used to evaluate Diddy's actions. Frameworks determine limits, and limits determine outcomes. This is why the life sentence discussion did not resurface as a dramatic threat, but as a procedural possibility. Sentencing frameworks are built to respond to severity as it is understood at the time of decision. When understanding deepens, those frameworks must adjust. Cassie's CCTV deepened understanding in a way that could not be reversed. Reversal requires ambiguity. Ambiguity no longer exists. Severity is now being measured across duration, control, and sustained impact. Cassie's presence within Diddy's environment is no longer seen as incidental. It is seen as continuous. And continuity changes how responsibility is assigned. Responsibility that is sustained is treated differently than responsibility that is momentary. That distinction is at the heart of this case's final phase. Another critical factor now shaping the outcome is institutional memory. Courts do not only decide cases, they decide how those cases will be viewed later. They are acutely aware of moments in history where restraint was later interpreted as oversight. That awareness doesn't create bias. It creates obligation. Obligation to be thorough. Obligation to be defensible. Obligation to align outcome with understanding. That's why the process feels quiet. Quiet does not mean passive. Quiet means deliberate. Deliberation favors coherence over emotion. And coherence is exactly what now defines the case against Diddy. Cassie's CCTV did not introduce chaos. It introduced clarity. Clarity narrowed interpretation. Narrowed interpretation raised consequence. This is also where defense strategy reaches its limit. Arguments based on fragmentation no longer apply. Attempts to contextualize behavior must now confront documented consistency. Silence is no longer neutral. Explanation is no longer flexible. Every path forward carries weight. As this final phase unfolds, the system is asking one question above all others. Does the outcome reflect the most complete and accurate understanding now available? If the answer is yes, the outcome will hold. If the answer is no, adjustment will continue until that alignment is reached. Alignment is not optional. It is the endpoint of reassessment. This is why the case will not conclude with spectacle. It will conclude with justification. A justification that explains how Cassie's CCTV, Cassie's testimony, and Cassie's consistency reshaped the evaluation of Diddy's conduct. Once justification replaces speculation, the story reaches completion. Completion does not mean agreement. It means obligation has been fulfilled. And that obligation is no longer abstract. It is anchored to Cassie, it is contextualized by the reckoning, and it is applied to Diddy. This case will be remembered not for how loudly it unfolded, but for how thoroughly it was re-examined, for how reframing forced accountability, and for how integration replaced denial. That is its legacy. If you followed this breakdown to the very end, I want to hear your perspective. Do you believe Cassie's CCTV ultimately changed the legal trajectory of Diddy's case, or was the life sentence discussion inevitable once everything finally aligned? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want ongoing, evidence-focused analysis that follows cases beyond the headlines and into the decisions that truly matter, make sure you subscribe to The Hidden Evidence. More stories are unfolding, and the most important details are always the ones hidden beneath the surface.